Um, Welcome everyone. So this is actually the closing webinar for Wildlife Week. It's been a good week. I hope some people have gotten a chance to get in and get a chance to see some of the other webinars this week. We've had some, different regional ones. We've had some internal exercises. So yeah, been a great week so far. And I think this is a great session to close it out. So what I'll do is I'm just going to give a bit of an introduction to what we'll be talking about today, as well as the presenters, and then I will hand over to Mike and Jenny to pass along the information. So I will be recording everybody's just to make an awareness. There is a Q&A bar at the top of your screen that you should see. So if there's any questions throughout the presentation, you can write into that Q&A, and the presenters will be able to address those during a point of stop or at the end. But if you have any questions towards the end as well, we'll take some time to give you a chance to ask those questions to the presenters. But if anything comes up while the presenters are going, you can just pop that in the Q&A and they'll be able to see that towards the end. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and introduce the session. So this is a oiled wildlife response in offshore and nearshore events. And what we'll be doing is we will be talking a little bit about the guidelines on conducting operations in offshore and nearshore and how that may some of the nuances to responding to wildlife in offshore and nearshore environments. We're going to look at some strategies for planning and undergoing a wildlife response when that oil is transitioning from an offshore and nearshore environment towards a shoreline. An effective transition can help mitigate any issues with species and impact. And so we're going to look at how that can be planned. We'll also take a look at hazing and deterrence techniques in offshore and nearshore environments to reduce wildlife impact. And we'll touch a bit on some real life case studies and examples when we've had scenarios like this. So we have two really good presenters today to go through this. So I will introduce them quickly and then I will let them deliver the content because that's what we're here for. So we have Mike Ziccardi. Mike Ziccardi is from the UC Davis One Health Institute. He is a DVM, MP, VM, and a PhD in epidemiology, emphasizing free-ranging wild health and effects on petroleum exposure in wildlife. He's been in the oil spill response veterinarian role since 1996. He's responded to more than 40 spills in the U.S. and abroad, including ones that have marine mammal and sea turtle group leads as for Deepwater Horizon. He was a contract veterinarian for the California Department of Fish and Game, a wildlife epidemiologist for the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago, and a co-director at the Karen C. Dreyer Wildlife Health Center at UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. He holds some current positions, so he's the director of Oiled Wildlife Care Network. He's the executive director at UC Davis One Health Institute, the director of the California Veterinary Emergency Team, and a health science clinical professor at UC Davis. And so he'll be one of our presenters today. And in supporting Mike and helping deliver some of the material is Jenny Schlieps. She's from Focus Wildlife. She is the program manager and rehabilitation manager for Focus Wildlife. She began there in 1994, she began working with wildlife in 1994 and has an extensive experience with range of wildlife species. She's worked with seabirds, waterfowl, raptors, different terrestrial and aquatic mammals, turtles, amphibians, large carnivores, and marine mammals. She's had many responses since 2003. Some of her specializations are wildlife assessment, field stabilization, and direct animal care. She is also a founding and current board member of the Washington Wildlife Rehabilitation Association and serves on the board of the National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association. She graduated from University of Washington with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and holds a certificate from University of Washington in Applied Animal Behavior. So we are very happy to have you guys both, and thank you for taking the time to support this webinar. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and allow Mike to share his. So should be able to now. And I will go ahead and mute my mic and leave the floor to Mike and Jenny. Thank you very much.
Hey, great. Thank you, Michael. And can you guys see the screen okay?
Yep, all good.
Yes. Okay, great. So thank you all very much for being here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night to everyone there. As Michael said, we're going to try to cover a lot of information. This is about 3.5 hours of content that we've tried to compress into 30 minutes. So apologies in advance for that. We did generate some cheat sheet notes for everyone. So Michael should have sent that out to everyone. The notes themselves have all of the content in it that we'll be covering today. But really what we wanted to do is as Michael was saying, reviewing the risks of offshore and nearshore spills to wildlife and providing response options in those environments with an emphasis on hazing and deterrence techniques. I think we're all aware, preaching to the choir here, just the sheer volume of petroleum and other liquids that are in the sea at any given time, and the fact that deep water extraction has increased dramatically, and as has the number of offshore rigs. So the actual risks of spills in these environments continues to increase, and we need to be ready to address those from a wildlife perspective. Now, first, talking about offshore interactions. Typically, when we think about oil and its effects on wildlife, many people do not see offshore wildlife interactions with petroleum as significant as near shore. Typically, there are fewer observed affected animals during spills. There's a lower density of vertebrate species, and there's a greater area typically impacted. So the sheer concentration of oil and animals there is not there. However, in certain instances, and I think we're all aware of this from the Macondo incident, it can have serious impacts in certain situations. Now, going through offshore impacts in certain species, starting with birds, because birds are the most visible species that we think about. Typically, the impacts on individual animals are similar to nearshore. Oil causing problems with hypothermia, the ability of animals to retain an air layer next to their skin, causing the body temperature to decrease, decreasing buoyancy, the inability to stay at the surface, and an inability to forage in the environment. One challenge in an offshore environment is oftentimes they cannot get out of the water, so they're more susceptible. In nearshore environments, many species can get onshore to try to stay warm and to avoid the buoyancy issues. In an offshore environment, they really can't unless they find something to climb up onto. So it is a unique challenge in these environments. Also, in these situations, if there is oil out there, offshore platforms are lit at night. Therefore, for animals that are partially oiled and still flighted, they can use those platforms to actually as an attractant to get them there. Moving from an individual to a species impact, there may be more sensitive species in an offshore environment versus a nearshore. Those species, such as albatross, highly adapted to aquatic environments, and those that transit long distances. So those are things that can cause a unique effect in those situations. So the results of that is that there may be animals out there that are affected and different species, but oftentimes those animals that we do see are a significant underestimate of affected animals versus the nearshore. Now, for marine mammal species, this is the environment where typically the greatest impact is going to occur. External effects in marine mammals, just as background, is usually less problematic, and I'm talking whales, dolphins, porpoises, species of that nature. Internal effects, though, is where we're most concerned. So respiratory effects from explosive breathings as they breach the surface, gastrointestinal effects from ingestion of oil, and metabolic effects from either ingesting or inhaling the product, actually entering the blood system and affecting all the organs in the animals. These impacts can have species levels effect, and I think we saw this most strikingly in Barataria Bay off of Louisiana during the Macondo incident, where there was a population level effect in those animals. So the results of these is that there can be significant effects, but oftentimes it's based on the location. The offshore environment is where these effects are going to be seen. But again, it's going to be difficult to determine overarching impacts because these animals are often very difficult to see. Now, sea turtles. Sea turtles are similar to marine mammals in that external effects are typically less problematic. Their skin is impenetrable. So eye irritation, mucous membrane problems, things of that nature is usually what we're seeing in the external effects, but internal effects is where the problems occur from ingestion and simply the physical coating of oil. During Macondo, there were animals trapped in the moose during that incident where they literally were stuck in that and could not move. And so those can have significant effects in the animals and the metabolic effects. Again, if they're ingesting the oil, the effects to the organ systems in the body. Impacts on the species. With sea turtles, the juvenile and subadult phases are the ones that are in the offshore environment versus the adults are in the nearshore environment. So this is where the primary effects are going to be in the neritic habitat. And the location of the turtles is going to be similar to where oil will accumulate. So when the wind rose in the offshore environment, the windrows is where animals are going to congregate, both for food items as well as injured animals actually being attracted to areas where the wind is taking them. So this is the region where most of the effects will occur. And again, it's difficult to determine overarching impact because it's difficult to see them. Offshore oil impacts. What we see, there are certain activities in the offshore environment that cause these effects, indirect effects of oil spills can cause injuries to animals as well. These actions include cleanup actions such as skimming, but they also alternative response techniques such as control burns and chemical dispersants. So briefly, skimming, I think everybody on this call understands skimming. The main concerns we have in the offshore environment is animals can be trapped in product. So the simple skimming activities, if animals are injured, they can actually be collected at the same time as the oil. So minimizing risk of this, we did develop a number of techniques during the Macondo incident to try to reduce this. And those are listed here on the screen where exclusion grates are installed on certain types of skimmers, and then actually having trained observers on the highest risk platforms to make sure that if animals are collected in those high risk platforms, they can be actually taken out of the oil that is being skimmed off and hopefully taken to a tertiary wildlife activities such as rehabilitation at that time. With dispersants, chemical dispersant application, some of the concerns in wildlife species is while dispersant is a very effective tool in the toolbox, it can make more oil more bioavailable once it gets into the water column. There is a underlying question of bioconcentration and food web effects in higher vertebrate species. These are questions that continue to be raised and just now starting to address from a research perspective. But there's also unclear effects of the dispersant itself on bird mammals and turtles. The dispersant has both the solvents and the surfactants in them. Solvents can have direct damage to animals just simply from the external coating. The surfactants themselves can disrupt waterproofing. Some of the research that we have done show that the surfactants in chemical dispersants can actually cause animals to lose waterproofing at the same degree as oil itself. So there is a concern, again, with direct application if animals are in the dispersant release. So to minimize risks associated with this, there are a number of recommendations. Overflights prior to dispersant application to look at species at risk. Determination of a go, no-go of application, whether animals are within a certain radius, whether there's a certain concentration of animals within the application zone. Making sure that wildlife authorities are involved in planning as well as application operational activities, and reviewing the plan to make sure that wildlife experts are involved in the development of that. Control burns are very similar in the approach that we take on that, but the concerns are the pyrogenic PAHs that are generated on that. There's unclear effects of the charred residual material for control burns, and booming. Use of fire booms can entrain wildlife which theoretically can be burned with the oil when the oil is set off. Again, similar to dispersant application, control burns are very effective for removal of oil and absolutely should be in the toolbox, but there does need to be some risk mitigation associated with them. So deploying trained observers on burn operations, both in the aerial overflights, if they're used during burns, as well as in the igniter boats, to survey the boom to make sure animals are not entrained. To recover animals, if they are collected within fire boom, determination of go, no go ignition, and then reviewing and commenting on the plan. Now, ship applications during spills can also be problematic in wildlife. The potential of ship strike, large whales are increasingly being killed during by ships during non-spill times. But then also during spills, because of the increase in vessel traffic, there is a challenge of potential injury. There's also a challenge of disturbance in the offshore environment. Also, if night operations are occurring, lift offshore vessels can attract animals onto the vessels themselves, which is both a good thing in that those animals can be collected, but it's a bad thing because they are being affected. So to minimize these risks, there's a number of things, especially for large cetaceans, that can be done. Basically, moving whales, moving ships, or excluding whales are the three. Moving whales is very difficult. There have been some limited tests of shipboard alarm devices to try to move animals away from the ships. They're really not practical at this point. So what has been chosen is moving the ships from visual observation of large whales in the path, passive and active acoustics to try to determine where animals are. But then predictive modeling. During certain times of the year, large whales, especially those at high risk, can be in high densities in certain areas. So by using predictive modeling, it can actually determine what areas are of highest risk. And it could very well be that vessel speeds are reduced during specific times to try to minimize the problems. Plane strike is another issue in an offshore environment. Concerns are that plus disturbance in those habitats, actually having animals that may be lightly oiled or unoiled in there, having planes or helicopters coming through, disturbing animals and moving them to higher risk areas. So to minimize these risks, there are best management practices that have been developed to try to maintain an appropriate altitude and then also to avoid highly dense population areas if possible. Now, in offshore environments, we have a number of different options that we can use for wildlife that are affected or at risk. First and foremost, reconnaissance, doing surveys of areas, doing the initial assessment to determine presence and density of affected animals. It can really be beneficial to determine scope of impact and to predict locations where animals occur. However, there's no direct advantage to affected animals, and it can be difficult to get approval to do intensive reconnaissance during active and spill response, and it does require skilled observers to determine what species are there and to actually see these animals. Recovery can also occur going in the offshore environment and collecting oiled animals for rehabilitation. It does benefit individual animals. It is an active response technique, and it would collect animals that may not come ashore if they're in an offshore environment. However, it's extremely labor and resource intensive. It may interfere with cleanup operations, and safety is questionable in many times. So oftentimes we are not recommending strongly large-scale recovery in offshore environments, except in certain instances. Our third technique that we think about is hazing and deterrence, and that's really where we're going to focus the rest of the offshore discussion. Initial overall deterrence considerations. So this is both for offshore and nearshore. So I'm going to present it here and not present it in the nearshore environment. Some of the things we need to think about when we're considering the use of deterrence, scaring animals away from the oil. First, current oil location and predicted extent. We need to have a place to scare animals to. So if the oil is continuing to move, we don't want to move them from one area to another that might be oiled tomorrow. We need to think about high density wildlife areas and important wildlife areas. So use of local experts, environmental sensitivity indices, or other types of biological information to determine both where animals are and both where animals might go and remain there. We need to think about available alternatives. So not only scaring animals away, but the potential of making areas of lower risk more attractive to animals so that they will go to those areas and remain there. You need to think about the species. There are very different successes for different hazing techniques based on species and taxa. Certain species are very easy to scare away and will remain away. Other species will not scare off a certain area. And there are certain species that will go, leave, and then come back very quickly. We need to think about safety. Many of these techniques do use flammable items. And so in a situation where you have explodable gases in the environment, those may not be the techniques to use. Some of these may be considered weapons. And so in a city environment, carrying around some of these items may not be publicly appropriate. Also need to ensure safety and adequate worker training for all of these things. Think about weather. Weather can significantly affect these items, especially the visual techniques that are used. So consider that. Consider season and phenology. Migrants are often easier to disperse because they're coming through an area already versus animals that are there permanently. There may be animals on breeding grounds that will not leave because that is where they have to be. Molting birds, they cannot fly. And so thinking of animals that you want to scare off, they may have an inability, physiologic inability to actually leave due to that. And thinking of coverage limits. Some of these techniques will only have a very short range of activity. So thinking about those techniques as you're deciding on options are very important. Now, in the offshore environment, there's a number of things we can use. Explosives, so firecrackers or cracker shells, auditory devices, actually producing sound to try to scare animals off, and the use of vehicles, so vessels or aircraft. Now, explosives, underwater firecrackers have been used in certain situations for marine mammals. So those items that will explode, causing an acoustic signal, scaring animals away. Challenge with them is there's potential injury to the animals themselves and a human safety issue. And they have been seen to have variable success. Cracker shells, instead of exploding underwater, it's actually firing them above water and having the sound occur. They can go 15 to 25 meters off. They are safer because the explosion's going off, but there is rapid habituation in bird species, at least for these. And one of the key issues is these are flammable. So the use in spill environments where you have gases there is a concern. Other auditory devices that can be used, Wakami pipes is one that is in the literature the most. It's actually a steel pipe that is suspended in the water, banged on. It actually produces a sound wave that will then go. They have been used in the past by Japanese to herd dolphins in historically for capture. They've had limited success in larger whales, but they are the technique that is currently being considered and planned for killer whales in the Pacific Northwest. Acoustic deterrent devices, pingers or clangers, they produce a periodic sound emission, so an electronic sound. They have been very effective in pinnipeds and porpoises, but it's question as far as there is success in larger cetaceans. Now, acoustic deterrents produce a sound that is not damaging to the animals, but is uncomfortable. An acoustic harassment device actually produces sound at a level that can cause injury and damage to hearing. So it is a higher powered one. It is more effective, but it can be injurious to the animals that you're trying to scare. The last type is an electronic sound generator, two types that are commercially available, Phoenix whalers and Brecco buoys. They actually produce a programmable and changing sound that is broadcast out of speakers. It can be low habituation because the sounds can be changed. As time goes on, it can be on a digital loop, and so you can change those things, but it does require active monitoring to make sure, because you're typically floating these in or near the slick itself. So making sure that they are moved as the slick moves and that they're not running out of batteries so that the sound continues to be generated. Vehicle harassment, the last deterrent technique that's often used offshore environments. So boats have been used to hurt and harass. To be honest, the most effective hazing and deterrent technique is actually the cleanup operation, because the vessels out in the offshore environment to try to clean up the oil is scaring away a lot of the animals. Helicopters, aircraft have been used in a limited fashion in an offshore environment, but more likely they're used on a nearshore environment. There's varied responses to that. Cetacea do get easily habituated to that. So especially the more intelligent coastal species, such as bottlenose dolphins, can habituate very quickly to a lot of boat traffic during spills. And there can be a temporary threshold shift in hearing, so that as vessels are going through, animals may, in essence, just tune out the sound of that if there's a lot of activity. Now, moving from an offshore environment to a nearshore environment. Nearshore, unlike offshore, is typically considered the most significant environment for damage to wildlife. Most of the wildlife that are observed, at least, are in a nearshore environment. There's a greater density of vertebrate species, and there's often a smaller area impacted, but a more sensitive habitat, such as mangroves or mud swamps. Those areas are very concentrated where the oil is, but highly sensitive. And the contamination is often more persistent in the environment. It is not degrading as quickly. The use of alternative response techniques is much less likely in these environments as well. So quickly going through the impacts. Impacts on individual birds is similar to offshore effects: hypothermia, the buoyancy, the inability to forage. Birds that are affected offshore might come near shore to attempt to get out of the aquatic environment, or they may float in on tides into that nearshore environment. And the nearshore environment may have your more lightly oiled individuals. So they have those animals that are still mobile, but have a small amount of oil that can still injure them or kill them, might be in this environment to try to stay warm. Impacts on the species, you may have impacts on nesting grounds, sensitive life stages in this environment, so hatchlings, etc. And even though the estimates of affected animals in this environment are going to be a greater proportion than offshore, it may still be a significant underestimate of animals that are affected. Now, with marine mammals, in the nearshore environment, we're getting a greater diversity of species. So this is where sea otters might be seen. This is where manatees or dugongs might be seen versus in the offshore environment. For otters, for fur seals, they can have similar effects to birds because they also utilize that air layer next to their skin to stay warm. So buoyancy, hypothermia, etc., can be seen in those species. With sirenids, which are manatees and dugongs, they can have effects similar to the offshore whales and dolphins, in that the external coating is not as problematic as ingestion and inhalation of the petroleum fumes and the oil itself. For nearshore cetacea, coastal bottlenose dolphins, for example, this is where you may see stranded live and dead mammals. So animals that are not doing well, they can actually strand themselves ashore, in which case you will see them and have to respond to them. And as far as sea turtles, this is where you're going to get the adult phase that is greater at risk. And oftentimes the adult phase is coming ashore during nesting and seasons, which is the greatest risk. So nearshore species for general living, but then also nesting periods. Their effects are going to be similar to the marine mammals. So skin and eye irritations, lesions, and then gastrointestinal and metabolic effects. Impact on the species, oil itself can directly affect eggs and hatchlings during those nesting periods. Now, for nearshore and onshore activities, there's a number of different techniques. There are a number of different things that are used for cleanup operations that can cause indirect effects on wildlife as well. So cleanup activities themselves can be injurious to wildlife, and then just the cleanup assessment and the general traffic. So with cleanup operations, when we're talking mechanical oil removal and booming in a nearshore environment, there are a number of things that need to be considered and need to be thought through when these techniques are used. Mechanical oil removal can have direct collection and damage to injured animals in that environment, especially if large heavy machinery is used on that. So dead or injured animals can be collected up with the debris. You can have disturbance of nesting habitat. You can have elimination of food items in the rack line. So many of these species are using that rack line. Insects starting to break down the seaweed and other things there. A lot of animals use that rack line as a food source. And so if the seaweed is being collected because there's oil there, you can also collect animals and remove their food source. And nighttime lighting can affect nesting turtles. They're attracted to light, or they are kept away due to nighttime lighting in nesting habitats, so that has to be considered. Booming can trap animals in oiled areas. They can be an attractant to unoiled animals by actually perching on the boom. Lost boom can damage habitat, and they can keep nesting turtles from actually reaching the beach. So in general, with disturbance, there are certain things that should be considered to minimize disturbance to wildlife during spills. So for birds, avoiding trampling nests or individuals in a disturbance during nesting season. With mammals, avoiding entering pupping areas. So marine mammal rookeries and habitats, avoiding that to keep animals from getting into the oiled water. Sea turtles, avoiding nesting beaches if at all possible. And the habitat itself, avoiding oil marshland and tidal flats so that oil is not entrained into that habitat, and avoid driving above the high tide line. So again, keeping injury to animals that might be feeding in that area. So staying in the wet sand is going to be much more risky. And I'm going to keep moving because we're running out of time. With nearshore wildlife options, typically we're breaking down wildlife options here into three different categories. Primary response options, so carcass recovery, dead animals being collected on the beach, or minimization of disturbance. Or secondary response options, either deterrence, scaring animals away, or displacement, actual capture of unoiled animals and moving them, or holding them until oil cleanup is completed. And then tertiary response, rehabilitation and recovery of oiled animals. Because of the time limitations, what we're really going to focus in on in this is the deterrence options here. There's lots of information on tertiary response that we're happy to point you to. So with nearshore deterrence options, usually we're thinking of three different types. Auditory, so creation of noise. Physical presence, trying to scare animals away because they think people are there. And then visual disturbance, trying to create a image that is going to scare animals out of risky areas. Auditory pyrotechnics, similar to the offshore environment where we can use cracker shells. We can also use other things that are created. So bird bombs, it's actually a starter pistol that's used that explodes at 20 to 40 meters. Screamers, it'll actually create a sound as it's shot off over the habitat. And then seal bombs, as we talked about earlier, can be very effective, can be relatively inexpensive, can be used at great distances, but they are hazardous, they're potential flammable, and they can have limited application depending on environmental conditions, such as windy, and their short duration, 1 to 2 hours. Animals can come back. Propane cannons or Zon guns is usually the ones that we think of as far as auditory noise generation in a nearshore environment, where it's creating a loud explosion that is done on an irregular basis. It can operate for long periods of time remotely and can be effective at a large distance. It's automatic, it can work day and night, relatively inexpensive, widely available. However, especially for bird species, there can be habituation, not as quickly as the pyrotechnics, but it can be a matter of 2 or 3 days. Um, Less effective in fog and wind because of the sound generation. And if you're near a residential environment, they may not like the sounds being generated. Biosonics is a more recent thing, and it continues to evolve. It's actually similar to the Brecco buoy in Phoenix Whaler offshore, where it's creating a distress call or a warning call on a regular tape, in essence, where the noise can be generated and you can have different noises that come through. The effectiveness of this, in addition to pyrotechnics or Zon guns, can be effective. So the use of multiple items should be considered. It's effective, lower sound intensities, and there's slower habituation because, again, the sounds are irregular and the sounds are mixed up. But it can also attract birds. So if you're using a alarm call on one species, it may attract a predatory species as well. So those things need to be considered. So moving from auditory to visual, flags, balloons, lights can all be used in certain instances. They're inexpensive, they're easy, they're readily available, and you don't have to be there. You can set a kite if there's a windy environment. You can set a kite and leave it, and it can be very effective. There is rapid habituation in bird species. It's obviously ineffective at night because they can't see it unless you combine it with lighting or other types of techniques, and wind or other environmental problems may occur. Other visual effects, more reflective versus visual detection. So reflectors, mirrors, and tapes. The most commonly used is the flags here with mylar tape. Inexpensive and easy, can be effective. Again, no attendance needed. You can use this on land or over water. You can extend a line across a waterway and extend flags down below it. Again, may attract some birds. Ineffective at night because you need a light reflection off of that to scare animals off, and you can have rapid habituation. Effigies and models, so trying to make it appear as if people are there. They're very effective if they're lifelike and they move like people do. There's a number of things that are out there. You can make it yourself out of some Tyvek and cardboard, like this picture. There's also a commercial product called Scary Man, which is a pop-up effigy that inflates, makes sound, and then deflates and then comes back up. At least in the US, a lot of car dealerships will actually use them to attract people in. So pros are they're readily put into place, easily remobilized, effective in all weathers, relatively inexpensive, especially if you make it yourself. However, rapid habituation, you're limited to daylight unless you combine it with lights or other devices, and it can be a small range of effectiveness because animals may feel comfortable being 100 meters or so away from a person. Now, with all of that involved, offshore, nearshore concerns, different techniques, different things. How do we keep all of these things in mind and do the best thing that allows cleanup to occur, but it keeps animals safe? And really, the best way to approach this is to think through it in the pre-spill planning and to develop best management practices both before a response and during a response. These best management practices detail those things that need to be done or considered to keep animals safe, as well as other techniques. And so during the Macondo spill, we did develop a list of 51 different best management practices during the response, many of which were directly wildlife related for this, to keep animals safe, to keep animals from being affected during the cleanup activity, both offshore and nearshore, and basically to allow the cleanup to occur. And apologies if that went very quickly. Again, we have the notes for you, and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you for, we'll open up the floor now. So yeah, as I mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to use the raise your hand feature if you just want to open your mic, or if you'd like to write them in the Q&A or the chat, and I'll just sort of field those and pass them along. So we'll just pause here and I'll wait for any questions.
Must have been a very complete conversation.
I did, one came in. Oh, we got one in the Q&A now. So great presentation. Barbara also asked if you'd be if we'd be able to share the presentation at the end, which, as long as that's good with you guys.
I think I sent the notes out and that has all the text in it.
Okay, so that
I would say go ahead and do that because
okay. Yeah, so I'll resend the notes in case people don't have them. I'll actually see if I can plug them into the chat for people now. So I'll do that while we're sitting here waiting for any final questions before we close out.
And I will put back up our email addresses. So if anything does come up after this, please reach out to Jenny and myself, and we're happy to answer any follow-up questions you might have.
And just a note, I don't believe I can share in the chat, so I will just follow up again with an email. You may already have it, but just in case there was people that joined the call that weren't on it on the list beginning, I'll just resend to everybody. So you may have a duplicate from me, but just ignore if you already have those notes. One question just came in. It says, how important is it to the wildlife response to capture the animals and do the stabilization offshore?
Jenny, do you want to touch on
Sure. I mean, I think it depends on the specific situation of the response, but we have set up certainly field stabilization offshore on vessels. So the problem there typically, I think, with real offshore events is to be able to ensure that you have appropriate and timely transport from offshore animals where stabilization is happening on a vessel to a facility somewhere inland. The full suite of rehabilitation activities can't really take place offshore, but field stabilization certainly can. So again, scenario dependent. That's sort of my take on that. I don't know, Mike, if you have differing opinion on that.
No, I agree completely.
Great, thank you. I actually have a question. So we, in a response in Peru, we had a lot of the species that were molting, so they were not diving. I believe it was penguins, if I'm not mistaken. They weren't diving into the contaminated water. But I guess my question would be, in that scenario where maybe they're approaching the end of their molt, and may have the tendencies to start going back into water and that risk, would that be somewhere where you would have to sort of decide whether to go in and collect and remove, or how do you manage that kind of changing from a molting season to coming back to normal where they're going to start to put themselves at risk?
I'll start on that one, and then you can follow up, Mike. So whether it's molting or any time like in a breeding season where there are certain populations that might be, breeding on, let's say a rock or island environment and then come into the water later, I try to prioritize cleanup. That is the number one most effective way that we're going to ensure that wildlife isn't impacted. Um, Trying to really direct wildlife, particularly if they've been out of the water during molt and have a lack of food resources available to them or have diminished, ability to eat or simply stop eating because they're breeding. So they're not eating as consistently. That really impacts their underlying health. So trying to actually change their behavior rather than clean up the spill itself, it's far less successful. So I always look to clean up first, mitigation second. I guess that's my thought on it.
Great.
Agree completely. That's when we talk about the primary, secondary, and tertiary wildlife response techniques. Supporting the cleanup operation is primary, so it should be always the first thing that's considered in doing that. And ultimately, if you do have a situation where you have molting animals or animals that cannot normally get away, you do need to weigh risks versus benefits and whether or not what the proportion of oiled animals is there and the potential of especially molting or breeding. It could very well be you go into a breeding habitat to collect 3 or 4 oiled animals and they end up crushing 30 or 40 eggs or chicks. And so you do need to really understand the ecology of the species that you're wanting to assist and weigh risks of any types of interventions when you're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important piece, and one of the things that we consider when we talk about the wildlife assessment, right, is understanding the specific behaviors of those species, and are we going to lose an entire breeding season's worth of young, and potentially then recruitment down the line, particularly if we're talking about threatened or endangered species, and there are a lot of considerations that go into that. So. It's a lot at play in those questions.
Okay, thank you. I see one hand up. I see there's a question in the chat as well. I'll do that one first. Good reflection on the possible effects of dispersants on wildlife. Are there any known cases of impact that can be associated with the use of dispersants?
Go, Mike.
So in a real life use situation, no. I think the instances where chemical dispersants were used in a wide way, we were able to establish best management practices to reduce potential impact. In experimental, there has been. So work that we've done here at UC Davis has evaluated both chemically enhanced water fractions, oil and dispersant and the dispersant itself. And what we have seen is significant loss of waterproofing in an experimental situation, both in feathers themselves and in live birds. So the potential is there. Just like everything, it's dose dependent. And so whether or not the amounts that animals are affected by and whether it's direct application of the chemical dispersant or dispersed oil is a question. We've talked about where for nearshore habitats where you have how large concentrations of birds, but you do need to use dispersant, the potential of providing haul outs for animals to easily get, if they are affected either by dispersant or dispersed oil, the ability to get out. The things that we did see with the dispersant application alone is that there was 100% loss of waterproofing, but that waterproofing was back the next day. So if they can survive the initial exposure, they can recover 100%. So trying to avoid that, at least in an experimental setting, seems to be key.
And that's also species dependent, right? Because you're working with a species that can typically get out of the water.
Correct.
Great, thank you. Barbara, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you, Mike and Jerry. Very nice listening you and learning with you. My question is, how could we improve the use of the acoustic equipments to do mammal deterrence before an emergency that we don't expect to happen? Because I'm asking this because we have included some equipment on our tier 2 contract, and we don't have many experience in Brazil using them, like the OICOM tube and the pingers. What could you tell us about this to have some experience if we ever need to use them? Thank you.
Maybe I'll just start with a comment on the Okomi pipes. So there is some difficulty in thinking about deploying those in real offshore environments. So Okomi pipes have been used very successfully, along with a couple of other devices like Hukilau, to herd small cetaceans into enclosed areas like bays. So it can be very successful in that way, but it is fundamentally transmitting sound underwater, which is not directional. So to try to move animals using Okomi pipes, when you're talking about really doing it in open ocean, that's a very difficult prospect. And typically, the easy part is collecting the pipes because it's just a pipe and you can cap it and you can get a hammer to bang on it. The difficulty is the number of vessels that you need to create a line or a barrier so that you can try and herd those animals while you are using the pipes. So, in an offshore environment, you're really talking about something like 25 to 50 vessels with a boat driver and a person to bang the pipes, and that has to be done repeatedly. The pipes all have to hang at the same or very similar level so that they bang at the same depth. So it looks like a very easy solution because it's just a pipe, but the complexity around it is pretty hard. So we use it a lot in the Pacific Northwest, which is where I'm from, and so it's used particularly because there's a subspecies of killer whale here that is, very close to dying out. There's, I think, about 70 individuals left, 72. But Okomi pipes really need a lot of support and a lot of training to make sure that they're happening correctly and that they're used correctly and can be used in a way that really moves the animals away from the spill rather than just moves them and you don't know where they're going to go. So not high on my list of immediate devices to be deployed. I don't know, Mike, if you have specific thoughts on some of the other acoustic.
Marine mammal deterrence in general is very difficult. There is no ideal solution for it. They're highly intelligent. They're highly mobile. They're living in a three-dimensional environment where they can go under and around any techniques. And usually the areas that are of greatest risk, you need to have a safe place to scare them to. And in an offshore spill, because it's spreading, there's not, unlike a coastal environment where you have a bay or a shore that is going to be affected and you can scare them to the next bay. In this environment, it's much more difficult. So there's been a lot of attempts to try to identify good, if not great, deterrent techniques in marine mammals, and it's just really, really difficult. So that's why having everything that you have available and trying them and rotating them is going to be the most successful.
And typically for large cetaceans, the thing that we have found most successful really is having an observer team. So a cetacean-specific observer, oftentimes along with a bird observer on a vessel. so that you can at least be forewarned, as well as, if there are if there are whales in the area, as well as using other, local agency personnel who can tell you if there are transiting whales coming through the area. Typically, that is the most helpful thing, is to be able to understand when those animals are in the area.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we're getting towards the end, but I think we have just two last questions that we'll take in the chat. And then if there's any other questions, I'm sure that Mike and Jenny would be happy to answer offline. So one from Jennifer: do you have any advice for developing countries who do not have access to the immediate resources described in the presentation? The current management plan for a major oil spill in South Africa generally lists the use of dispersants, together with the collection of large birds, together with the potential removal of wildlife that can be captured onshore or are already on the shore.
A lot of the techniques that we talked about as far as deterrence and hazing, a lot of them can be used at a relatively low cost. So especially a lot of the visual options. So the reason we talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary response options is that should be the way you think about implementation of them in order. Both for planning as well as response. So primary response options, keeping oil away from the animals. And so assisting in the cleanup operation, participating in the initial assessment and the ongoing reconnaissance, seeing where animals are and working with cleanup operations. Secondary options is hazing and deterrence. So scaring animals away from high risk areas. And so using tape and we use aluminum pie tins that are pennies US per each in certain instances to keep animals away. So knowing the ecology of the species that are at risk and thinking of things to use to try to keep them out of high risk areas does not have to be expensive. It does take pre-planning and pre-thought. And only if those things, primary and secondary options, fail, that's where you go to tertiary, which is the collection of animals that are oiled and then the rehabilitation. Jenny?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that wildlife response does really well is work with the SCAT teams in prioritizing areas for cleanup based on the susceptibility of animals in that area. And that in and of itself is a human activity that is constantly changing and moving and has light conditions that are different. And that is a really, really effective deterrent. So there are a lot of methods for cleanup. I mean, what you described is really sort of the foundation of every plan everywhere that I've seen, right? It's sort of, the standard. There are, as Mike said, a lot of inexpensive methods. The key is being sure that you can differentiate between hazing non-oiled birds versus accidentally hazing or deterring oiled birds that you might need to capture. So prevention of oiling, and that you understand when certain deterrence devices can also act as an attractant. So.
Great, thank you. All right, and then just, I know it is 11, so if people have to jump off, totally understandable, but we'll just, for the last question from Adam, a great presentation. Do you want to comment on the legal implications of some of the techniques described, not just referring to explosions, explosives, etc., but also the need for license to disturb cetaceans or preemptive capture? Need to consider this when planning.
Yeah, licensure, getting approval from wildlife authorities is absolutely crucial. In the US, any hazing deterrents that are used in all species is considered take, or just in essence, just as problematic as hunting in essence. And so having the appropriate permits for disturbance of wildlife and having the appropriate authorization to use many of these things, which are pyrotechnics, explodable items, etc., is important. For marine mammals, at least in the US, there is a single permit that exists in the entire United States that allows hazing of marine mammals. So seals, sea lions, and cetacea. That permit is held by the National Marine Fisheries Service, by the National Marine Mammal Stranding Coordinator. So everybody that is using hazing and deterrent items with the attempt to scare off marine mammals has to be a sub-permittee under that federal authorization. So there are some very distinct steps that need to be taken for planning purposes in every country. Thinking through those things in a contingency plan, in a pre-spill plan is absolutely essential. To make sure you know what the rules and regulations are in your country and in your area, even before you start purchasing the items that can be used.
Yeah, and there may be, depending on where you are, but most countries have a requirement for specific authorization if the species you're trying to deter are threatened or endangered.
Alrighty, well, thank you very much. I think that will wrap everything up. I have no other questions on the Q&A or the chat. So first off, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Jenny, for taking time to support this webinar. Very informative to me, and I'm sure that the participants will agree. So thank you very much for that. And thank you, everyone who participated. I think this was a great wildlife week, and we look forward to the next one. So this is officially the end of Wildlife Week 2024, but you will hear from us, into next year on the planning for 2025, because we will be doing this again. So stay tuned next year for Wildlife Week 2025. And again, thank you everybody for your participation. We will go ahead and close the meeting now, and I will follow up with the meeting notes from this. Oh, Paul's just got, I think he was just putting his hand up for a second, but thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.